11-year-old Louis Armstrong cried for the first time while listening to music, and the woman who played that music never knew she created a legend. 1912, New Orleans colored waif's home. Louis had been sent here for firing a gun into the air in the streets, undisciplined, angry, a child who had given up hope on life. But one morning, a sound coming from the reform school's music room changed everything. Music teacher Miss Sarah Collins was playing a spiritual on the piano, and Louis froze in the hallway. That sound, that melody, that emotion, it awakened something Louis had never felt before. For the first time, music wasn't just sound. It was a language, a salvation, a hope. Louis began attending her lessons, memorized every note she played, engraved every piece of advice she gave into his heart. But 6 weeks later, Miss Collins suddenly left town and never returned. Louis couldn't even thank her. Years later, even when he became world famous, Louis would say, "My real teacher lasted 6 weeks, but she gave me 50 years of lessons." So where did Miss Collins go? And why could Louis never thank her? The answer reveals one of music history's most bittersweet stories, about a teacher who changed everything and never knew it, and a student who spent his life trying to honor a debt he could never repay. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, because what you're about to discover shows how 6 weeks can change not just one life, but the entire course of music history. 3 weeks before Louis Armstrong entered the colored waif's home, he was living on the streets of New Orleans in the Storyville district, surviving day by day in ways no 11-year-old should have to. His mother, Mary Ann, worked as a laundress, cleaning white people's clothes for pennies, and she barely made enough to feed herself, let alone Louis. His father, Willie, had abandoned the family when Louis was an infant, so Louis grew up essentially raising himself, sleeping wherever he could find shelter, eating whatever he could scavenge or earn through odd jobs, learning to navigate a world that had no interest in the survival of poor black children. Louis wasn't a bad kid. He was a desperate kid, doing whatever it took to survive in a city that offered children like him almost nothing except early graves or prison cells. The gun incident that landed Louis in the waif's home happened on New Year's Eve, 1911, going into 1912. Louis had found an old pistol in the street. Not an unusual occurrence in Storyville, where violence was common and discarded weapons could be found if you knew where to look. Louis didn't plan to hurt anyone with the gun. He just wanted to celebrate the new year the way he'd seen adults do, firing shots into the air in excitement. But when police heard the shots and found 11-year-old Louis holding a smoking pistol, they didn't care about his intentions. He was arrested immediately, and because he had no father to vouch for him and his mother couldn't afford a lawyer, Louis was sentenced to an indefinite stay at the colored waif's home for boys, a reform school designed to take troubled children off the streets and teach them discipline, work ethic, and hopefully a trade that might keep them out of more serious trouble as adults. The first 2 weeks at the waif's home were the hardest of Louis's young life, even harder than living on the streets. At least on the streets, Louis had freedom. He could come and go as he pleased, sleep when he was tired, eat when he found food. But at the waif's home, everything was regimented, controlled, scheduled. Wake up at 5:30 in the morning, breakfast at 6, chores until 8, classes until noon, more chores, dinner, study time, lights out at 8. Louis hated it. He felt like a prisoner, which in many ways he was. The other boys were tough, mean, competitive, everyone fighting for scraps of respect and status in a place where nobody had much of either. Louis got into fights almost daily during those first 2 weeks. Not because he wanted to, but because showing any weakness meant becoming a target for bigger, meaner boys who would take whatever you had and leave you with nothing. The information in this video is compiled from documented interviews, archival news, books, and historical reports. For narrative purposes, some parts are dramatized and may not represent 100% factual accuracy. We also use AI-assisted visuals and AI narration for cinematic reconstruction. The use of AI does not mean the story is fake. It is a storytelling tool. Our goal is to recreate the spirit of that era as faithfully as possible. Enjoy watching. But on his 3rd week at the waif's home, something happened that would change not just Louis's experience there, but the entire trajectory of his life. The home had recently hired a new music teacher, a young woman in her mid-20s named Miss Sarah Collins. The Waifs' home had always had a music program. The administrators believed music could help discipline troubled boys, give them structure and purpose. But the previous teacher had left several months earlier, and the program had been dormant. Miss Collins was the first new music teacher in over a year, and her arrival created a buzz among the boys, mostly because having a young woman in the facility was unusual and therefore interesting to boys who spent their days surrounded only by other boys and stern male administrators. Louis first heard Miss Collins play on a Sunday morning when most of the boys were at chapel services. Louis had been assigned cleanup duty as punishment for his latest fight, so he was sweeping the hallway outside the music room while the other boys attended church. And then he heard it, piano music, unlike anything Louis had ever encountered. Not the ragtime he'd heard in Storyville bars, not the marching band music that played during parades, but something deeper, more emotional, more personal. Miss Collins was playing an old spiritual called "Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child," and she was playing it not as performance, but as prayer, each note carrying weight and meaning and genuine feeling. Louis stopped sweeping, broom falling from his hands, and just listened. For reasons he couldn't articulate, wouldn't be able to articulate for years, that music reached inside him and touched something he didn't know existed, some part of his soul that had been sleeping or hidden or protected, and it woke that part up. Tears started running down Louis's face, which shocked him because Louis Armstrong didn't cry. He had learned early that crying was dangerous, that showing emotion was weakness, that in his world you kept everything locked inside or people would use it against you. But listening to Miss Collins play that spiritual, Louis couldn't stop the tears, couldn't control the emotion flooding through him. It wasn't sad tears, or maybe it was, but it was also something else, something more complicated. It was the feeling of being understood without words, of having someone express what you'd been feeling but couldn't say, of realizing that music could carry things that regular language couldn't hold. Louis stood in that hallway crying and listening until Miss Collins finished playing. Then there was silence, and Louis wiped his face quickly, embarrassed, hoping no one had seen. But when he looked up, Miss Collins was standing in the doorway of the music room, looking at him with an expression Louis would remember for the rest of his life. Not pity, not contempt, but recognition, like she saw something in him that no one else had ever bothered to look for. "You heard that?" she asked quietly. Louis nodded, unable to speak. "Did you understand it?" Another nod. Miss Collins smiled, a gentle, genuine smile that made Louis feel safe in a way he hadn't felt in years. "Then you should learn to play it yourself." Do you think music can reach parts of us that words can't? Share your thoughts in the comments. That simple invitation, "You should learn to play it yourself," changed everything. Louis asked Miss Collins if he could attend her music classes, and she said yes without hesitation, without asking why he wanted to learn, or whether he had any natural talent, or whether he'd stick with it. She just said yes, and that was the beginning. The next day, Louis showed up for his first official music lesson with Miss Collins, along with about 15 other boys from the Waifs' home. Most of the boys were there because it was better than doing chores, not because they cared about music. But Louis was there because he needed to understand what he'd felt in that hallway, needed to learn how to create that feeling himself instead of just receiving it from others. Miss Collins started Louis and the other beginners on rhythm exercises, clapping, patterns, understanding beats, learning to feel music in your body before trying to play it on instruments. Louis was terrible at first. His timing was off, his coordination was poor, and several of the other boys laughed at him. But Miss Collins never laughed, never criticized, never made Louis feel stupid for struggling. Instead, she would demonstrate again, patiently, showing him exactly where the beat fell, helping him feel it rather than think it. "Music isn't math," she told Louis during one early lesson. "Music is breath and heartbeat. You can't think your way into music, you have to feel your way into it." After 2 weeks of rhythm work, Miss Collins let Louis try an actual instrument for the first time, a battered old cornet that had been sitting unused in the music room for years. The cornet, a simpler cousin of the trumpet, was tarnished and dented, missing one of its valve springs, but it was an instrument, and holding it made Louis feel like he was holding something precious. Miss Collins showed him how to position his lips, how to blow air through the instrument, how to press the valves to change notes. Louis's first sounds on the cornet were terrible. Squeaky, off-key, painfully loud. But underneath the technical inadequacy, Miss Collins heard something else. Genuine feeling, real emotion. The same quality that had made Louis cry when he heard her play piano. And she knew, though she never told him, that this 11-year-old boy with no training and no technique had something that couldn't be taught. He had soul. For the next 4 weeks, Louis attended Miss Collins' lessons every single day. He practiced in every spare moment, before breakfast, during breaks between chores, late at night when he was supposed to be sleeping. The cornet became an extension of Louis himself, the first thing in his life that felt like it truly belonged to him. And Miss Collins gave Louis something even more valuable than technical instruction. She gave him belief. Every time Louis made progress, she acknowledged it. Every time he struggled, she encouraged him. Every time he wanted to quit, and there were many times, she reminded him why he'd started, because music had made him feel something true, and that feeling was worth fighting for. If you're inspired by Louis's dedication, please subscribe. The most important part of this story is still to come. But as Louis was falling in love with music, Miss Collins was fighting a private battle she never shared with her students. She had come to the waif's home knowing she was sick, consumption, what we now call tuberculosis, a disease that was essentially a death sentence in 1912, especially for a black woman with limited access to medical care. Miss Collins had maybe a year to live, perhaps less, and she knew it, but she had chosen to spend whatever time she had left teaching, sharing what she loved with children who had so little love in their lives. Teaching at the waif's home wasn't prestigious or well-paying, but it was meaningful, and Miss Collins believed that meaning mattered more than longevity. What Louis didn't know, what none of the students knew, was that Miss Collins was getting sicker. She hid it well, never complaining, never showing weakness. But she was losing weight, growing weaker, coughing more frequently. The administrators at the waif's home noticed and urged her to take time off, to rest, to focus on her health. But Miss Collins refused. "I'm fine," she would say. "These boys need music more than I need rest." And she meant it, especially when it came to Louis Armstrong, the boy she had seen crying in the hallway, the boy who had responded to music with such raw, honest emotion. Miss Collins recognized something in Louis, not just talent, but need, the same need that had driven her to music years earlier when her own life had been difficult. The moment Louis had been dreading came on a cold Tuesday morning in late February, 1912. He arrived at the music room for his daily lesson and found it empty. No Miss Collins, no piano music, no welcoming smile. Louis waited, assuming she was running late, but she never came. After an hour, Louis went looking for answers and found the waif's home director, Captain Joseph Jones, who looked at Louis with an expression of uncomfortable sympathy. "Miss Collins won't be teaching anymore, son. She's gone home to be with family. She was sick, sicker than she let on. She left last night." Louis felt like the floor had disappeared beneath him. "Where?" he asked desperately. "Where did she go? Can I write to her? Can I visit?" Captain Jones shook his head. "I don't have that information, son. I'm sorry." Louis spent the next 3 days in a fog of grief and confusion. Miss Collins had been in his life for only 6 weeks, but she had changed everything, had shown him that he mattered, that he had value, that he could create something beautiful in a world that had mostly given him ugliness. And now she was gone, vanished without a goodbye, without a forwarding address, without any way for Louis to thank her or tell her what she'd meant to him. The battered old cornet she had given him was now Louis's most precious possession, and he practiced obsessively, as if playing well enough might somehow bring her back or at least honor her memory. What Louis didn't learn until much later, years later, was what had really happened to Miss Sarah Collins. She hadn't gone home to family because she had no family left. She had gone to Charity Hospital, the public hospital in New Orleans that treated poor patients, and she had died there 3 weeks after leaving the waif's home on March 14th, 1912. She was 26 years old. Her death certificate listed tuberculosis as the cause, along with complications from malnutrition and exhaustion. Miss Collins had literally worked herself to death, teaching music to troubled boys when she should have been resting, giving everything she had to children who needed something to believe in. And she died, never knowing that one of those children, the 11-year-old boy she'd found crying in the hallway, would become one of the most important musicians in history. Louis Armstrong continued studying music at the Waifs' home under a new teacher, Mr. Peter Davis, who recognized Louis's potential and pushed him to develop his skills. But Louis never forgot Miss Collins, never stopped thinking about the woman who had first shown him what music could be. As Louis's career took off, first in New Orleans, then Chicago, then New York, then eventually worldwide, he would often tell interviewers about his early musical education, and he always mentioned a teacher who had changed his life in just 6 weeks. But Louis didn't know her fate, didn't know she had died so young, didn't know that his attempts to find her and thank her were searching for someone who had been gone for decades. In 1935, when Louis was 34 years old and already famous, he returned to New Orleans for a concert. While there, he visited the colored waif's home, which was still operating, and asked the current administrators if they had any records about Miss Sarah Collins, the music teacher who had worked there briefly in 1912. The administrators searched their files and found only basic information. Her full name was Sarah Ruth Collins. She had been hired in December 1911. She had left in February 1912 due to illness, and there was no forwarding address. One elderly staff member who had worked there in those years remembered her and mentioned, almost casually, that she had heard Miss Collins had passed away shortly after leaving. Louis felt like he'd been punched in the stomach, all those years searching, hoping to find her and thank her properly, and she'd been gone the entire time. Louis tried to find Miss Collins' grave, wanting at least to pay respects at her final resting place, but there was no record of where she was buried. Like so many poor black people in early 20th century New Orleans, Miss Collins had probably been buried in an unmarked grave in a potter's field, her final resting place lost to history. This realization devastated Louis in a way few things had. The woman who had given him so much, who had believed in him when no one else did, who had changed the entire trajectory of his life, had died alone and poor and forgotten, buried in an unmarked grave with no one to remember her. From that point forward, Louis Armstrong made Miss Sarah Collins part of every interview, every biography, every reflection on his life and career. He couldn't give her a proper grave, couldn't thank her in person, couldn't repay the debt he owed her, but he could make sure she wasn't forgotten, could tell her story to anyone who would listen, could ensure that even though she died unknown, she would be remembered as the teacher who created a legend. "My real teacher lasted 6 weeks," Louis would say again and again throughout his career. "Miss Sarah Collins taught me for 6 weeks when I was 11 years old, and everything I've done since then has been building on what she gave me in that short time. She taught me that music isn't about notes, it's about feeling. She taught me that music can heal, can save, can transform. She died never knowing what she did for me, and that's my greatest regret." Louis Armstrong died in 1971, 60 years after Miss Sarah Collins briefly entered and then left his life. In those 60 years, Louis revolutionized jazz, influenced countless musicians, brought joy to millions of people, and became an American icon. But Louis never forgot the woman who started it all, the young teacher who was sick and dying herself, but chose to spend her final months giving troubled children something to hope for. In Louis's will, he left instructions that part of his estate should be used to create a scholarship fund for music teachers working with underprivileged children, and he specified that it should be called the Sarah Collins Memorial Fund, ensuring that her name would continue to have meaning long after both of them were gone. The impact of those 6 weeks in 1912 cannot be overstated. Without Miss Collins, Louis Armstrong might have remained just another troubled kid from Storyville, probably ending up dead or in prison before he turned 20. But because one teacher recognized something in a crying 11-year-old boy, because she gave him a battered old cornet and taught him that music was about feeling, not just technique, because she believed in him when he didn't believe in himself, because of all that, the world got Louis Armstrong. Every recording, every performance, every moment of joy his music created can be traced back to those 6 weeks with a teacher who died too young, too poor, too sick, and too unknown. Today, more than a century after Miss Sarah Collins taught music at the colored waif's home, her legacy lives on in ways she never could have imagined. The Sarah Collins Memorial Fund has provided music education to thousands of underprivileged children. Music teachers cite her story as inspiration for their own work with difficult students. And every time someone listens to Louis Armstrong play trumpet, that distinctive sound, that emotional depth, that ability to make you feel something true and real, they're hearing the echo of a dying woman who gave 6 weeks to an 11-year-old boy and changed music history forever. The tragedy of Miss Sarah Collins' story is that she never knew. She died at 26, probably thinking her life had been short and her accomplishments limited, never knowing that in 6 weeks she had planted a seed that would grow into something magnificent. She never got to hear Louis Armstrong play on the radio, never got to see him perform for presidents, never got to witness the global impact of the student she briefly taught. She just gave what she had, her time, her knowledge, her belief, to a child who needed it desperately. And then she died, forgotten and unknown, buried in an unmarked grave. But here's the beautiful truth that transcends the tragedy. Miss Sarah Collins' 6 weeks mattered infinitely more than most people's entire lifetimes. She didn't live long. She didn't become famous. She didn't accumulate wealth or status, but she changed one life profoundly, and that one life changed millions of other lives, and that impact continues rippling forward through time, touching people who weren't born until decades after Miss Collins died. That's the power of teaching, the power of believing in someone when they don't believe in themselves, the power of giving your gifts to others even when, especially when, you have so little time left to give. Louis Armstrong cried in that hallway when he was 11 years old because he heard music that touched his soul. Miss Sarah Collins saw those tears and recognized them for what they were. Not weakness, but openness, the sign of a heart that could feel deeply, which is the most important quality any musician can possess. She gave that crying boy a cornet and 6 weeks of lessons, and in doing so, she gave the world Louis Armstrong. She died never knowing she had created a legend. But the legend never forgot her, never stopped honoring her, never stopped trying to repay a debt that could never be fully repaid. That's the story of Miss Sarah Collins and Louis Armstrong, 6 weeks that lasted forever. A teacher who died unknown but whose influence echoes through a century. A debt that can never be repaid, but also never forgotten.